we are knocking out the South and the West in this time period that we've been looking at. We kind of looked at the West in terms of Native Americans, right? We covered that. We looked at the West in terms of mining. Now we got to look at the South in terms of civil rights or problems related to civil rights. What are we doing? We're all doing that now?
Yeah.
Okay, let's hurry up and learn. So we kind of left off the civil rights situation in 1877, and the story is it's about to get worse. What do you title it? The South and the West.
Why are your slides so sad now? They're like white. They're usually like fun colors.
I'll work on that. I'll put some, next week's imperialism, I'll put some pretty ships in the background for you,
Chips?
Ships, boats.
Oh, I thought you said chips.
The Navy.
I laughed at that dude. That picture you commented things. That was funny.
Thank
Wait,
you.
what? What happened? Wait, what happened?
I don't know, nothing.
Mason was like made a meme and it was
Yeah, he was very proud of that. All right, people, focus. So take a look at Southern society and pick up your story in 1877. In 1877, what happened in the South Bay?
In 1877, Reconstruction ended.
Reconstruction
Yes,
ends.
Bay.
Yes.
And that's
Slow
when
it, I slowed down.
that's when it starts to get bad for the former slaves, the African Americans in the South. Those that take over are called the redeemers, but keep in mind, redemption in their eyes is to disenfranchise, to take away the right to vote, and they are very effective in doing so because once they pass those laws, the troops are not there to support the African Americans, and they effectively are taking away the black vote. Without the black vote, they pass more discriminatory laws. They legalize segregation. The Supreme Court even backs that up in the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision. So your context, it's getting bad in the South. Think of it like end of the Civil War, African Americans, they've got the troops to protect them. They're in Congress, brief period of success. The Freedmen's Bureau, troops go away, redeemers take over, it gets bad. It will stay bad for quite some time, but there are a few leading voices trying to challenge that discrimination, racism, poverty, sharecropping, and I would argue you need a good chunk of information about each of them. Like in the end, a paragraph you could probably write. I've got several slides devoted to each of them, but let's just kind of step back. We'll look at Ida Wells, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois. You ready for it? You good? You got the context?
No.
Any questions on the context?
No.
What are you still writing?
I'm about to write Ida Wells, I'm sorry.
Oh, well look, I've got a separate slide devoted to each of them, so you can kind of title this person Booker T. Washington, and I would actually recommend you emphasize the T when you're writing his name, because it's going to really help you remember what he's all about. Sure, the Tuskegee Institute, outstanding if you already know that. Some might be familiar with the Tuskegee Institute from like the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II. They've made movies about it. If you're in ROTC, I know they teach you about the Tuskegee Airmen. But the point with that is that they have some kind of trade, skill, vocational art, and that's his goal. So think of it like Tuskegee, or think of it as simple as teaching.
Can you click it so we can see how to spell that?
I don't even have it up there.
Why would you T-U-S?
Tuskegee. You'll be fine. But
I don't even think I can.
the other point that you can write and understand is the teaching element. Because he believes through teaching, through learning some kind of skill, you will gradually get out of poverty. You will gradually defeat racism. You will gradually break through the segregated society that is now legal throughout the South. So he is a gradualist, but he again believes that through teaching or education or learning something, you can break free. And that Tuskegee Institute that you guys mentioned, when he designs it, it was like not even built yet. So in recruiting the first students for Tuskegee, you know what their first lesson was? Let's build the school. Like literally, let's build it from the ground. Let's learn how to make bricks. Let's learn how to, design this from the ground up. And with that skill, we're marketable. People will want to hire us, and we will gradually be able to rise the ranks in society. So that's kind of his method. Kind of makes sense to you? He writes his book. He was a former slave, and his key to success in his life was education. So he now wants to carry that over to all. He, was pretty eloquent in his writing. He was a great public speaker, and he's starting to get a decent amount of recognition, in part because he's not rocking the boat. Yeah.
Is Up From Slavery the name of his
That's the name of his book. Education is the key to everything about him. And keep in mind, he's not trying to say, we want immediately equality now. We want to change the law. We want to, do all that. For his kind of gradualist reasoning, he's pretty popular among both blacks and whites. Remember, like Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth? Andrew Carnegie gives $50,000 to the Tuskegee Institute. William Vanderbilt, remember the public be damned? He gives $50,000 to the Tuskegee Institute. So they are giving their money away, especially to this, because it's not trying to push the envelope. It's not trying to uproot the entire system. They're saying basically that gradually we'll be able to break free from poverty and defeat racism. So that's his MO, those are his goals. Self-improvement through like learning something, teaching, learning, Tuskegee. Kind of makes sense? So in his rise, in explaining all of this and writing it all, he eventually makes a big speech in Atlanta. You guys are actually reading about like the World Fair in 1893, right? You're reading about that? He makes a big speech at the 1895 like World Expedition in Atlanta, and he's one of the keynote speakers. He explains all of that, and they say his speech was well received. So he gets some support, but let me ask you this. Do they get equality as a result of Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute? No. And for that reason, he's not all that well received in the history books. In fact, some call him out. Some call Booker T. Washington an Uncle Tom, which you guys should also be familiar with since you read the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Who was Uncle Tom in the book? The old slave who was willing to tolerate his conditions no matter what. The old slave who wouldn't run away. The old slave that liked his slave-owning masters. So some call him out as being an Uncle Tom, especially this guy. This guy is at the exact same time period as Booker T. Washington. This is W.E.B. Du Bois, I've heard it said both ways. He actually calls Booker T. Washington an Uncle Tom. He says he's not doing enough. He says he's willing to tolerate the racism and segregation, and you actually need to fight it. So this guy, very articulate, intelligent, PhD from Harvard, by the way, first African American ever to get a PhD from Harvard. His thing is complete equality, and now. He wants to fight it in the court. If there's a racist, law, fight it. If there's, some kind of segregated society, fight it. And he also writes a book. He's very eloquent. He's very passionate. In fact, he's maybe best known for being the co-founder of an organization that's still around today. He's the co-founder of the NAACP. Don't stress too much of what it stands for, but I do think you need to know what the NAACP is. Yes, it fights it in the courts. It fights racism, it fights the bad laws in the court system, and is still around today. So originally founded in 1909, it takes some of the racist laws that are now on the books, and they fight it in the courts. So they'll challenge some of those laws. They don't have immediate success, but eventually they're able to overturn some of the racist laws that were out there. So still around today, that's this guy's thing. He's more of a immediate desegregation, whereas Booker T. Washington is a gradual desegregation guy. He'll stay around for quite some time. He'll write a book. He'll stay influential. We'll talk maybe some more on him when we get to the 1920s. She's also an advocate of the talented 10th, leading African Americans out of poverty, leading African Americans to break the racism and segregation, meaning like the most educated. That's his thing. You could compare the two. Booker T. Washington, Du Bois. Yes? Questions so far? Now Ida Wells. Ida B. Wells. She's fascinating. She was a former slave. She ends up living in Memphis, learning how to read, learning how to write, and she's the co-founder of a newspaper in Memphis. And she really gets her calling after this kind of riot at the People's Grocery. So let me just kind of explain what happens at the People's Grocery, and then all of this will fall into place. This was a grocery store that was kind of in a black neighborhood and a white neighborhood. There was a rival, like, black grocery store that emerged that was eventually attacked. And like a riot breaks out between blacks and whites in Memphis, and several black people end up getting arrested as a result of that riot. 3 of the guys are sitting in jail. That night, 75 white people broke into the jail and killed those 3 black guys before they were put on trial, before a judge and jury actually convicted them of anything that they did. That makes it her calling, to investigate lynching, to call out lynching, and to eventually write a book like documenting all of the lynching that's going on throughout the South and the United States.
I don't know if I'm supposed to know what this means, but what is lynching? I'm sorry.
Kind of what I just explained with the 75 white guys breaking into the jail,
So,
killing
like
those
a
3
law
black
taking
guys.
action against what they consider
Mob violence.
mob violence. Alright.
It's like a town, like, instead of going to the courts, they like decide if the person's guilty themselves.
And she ends up documenting all of these kind of lynching cases throughout the United States, and she's proving just how problematic it is. She calls out the federal government for not doing an anti-lynching law. And by the way, like, while she's doing all of that, she's also fighting for like the right to vote for women. She's also another co-founder of the NAACP. So Ida Wells does a lot. As for this lynching thing, I got to show you a few pictures of what's actually going on with it. Because after, say, an African American was lynched, oftentimes the town would take pictures of it and turn it into postcards. It gets pretty disturbing, and there are hundreds of these pictures out there of like the townspeople standing next to a burned body, hanging people. It's pretty ugly.
Should we write down the name of the book?
Should you write down the name of her book?
Well,
No. But just know that she's against lynching. And this is what she's investigating and calling out. She would oftentimes say how they're falsely accused of like rape, how that was a common thing where there may have been like a relationship between black men and white women. And if that were ever exposed, then the black person would be accused of rape and the town would ultimately kill them. So sometimes this would happen, they take pictures of it, or even worse, the entire town stands by proudly, and they literally would turn it into a postcard and send that out with like a little caption beneath. There's a really, really bad one from Waco that I'll eventually show you, because this is kind of an ongoing thing that happens through the 1960s. So we've got more on lynching later, but these are just some of the early ones that she's calling out. As for the frequency, some 5,000 lynchings do happen from the end of the Civil War through the 1960s, but look, after the troops are pulled out, whoa, it's happening a ton, and continues throughout the early 1900s and even the 1920s, and then a gradual decline. But yeah, there's a lot of lynching that will happen. So more on it, to be continued with that topic. Any lynching questions? Ida Wells, Booker T. Washington, Du Bois. Maybe another time to be grateful that you're not having to take the AP test. The last time the AP test asked about those 3, it was a comparative essay about Ida Wells, Booker T. Washington, and Du Bois compared to the civil rights guys of the 1920s, also compared to the civil rights advocates of the 1960s. So for my APers, they got to prep for that. You guys should be able to get your college credit just by surviving here. But they got to write that comprehensive and clear essay in order to pass the AP test. Fun for them, huh? Next topic, not as dramatic, but farming. Got to look a little bit at the farmer situation. which you already have some context with. So we need to build on that context, and then we zero in on the election of 1896, where the farmers have a fighting chance. Remember how deflation is like their central issue? How at least they think it's their central issue? It does reduce the price, and when prices fall, they don't make as much for their crop, right? That's what's happening after the Civil War. Prices are falling for a number of reasons. Can I get a little economic on you and preview maybe my wife's class explaining why this happens? Do you know why prices drop or why deflation occurs? The opposite. Inflation happens when you print too much money. So you have inflationary cycles if you print and print and print and print and print. That's actually what was done during the Civil War. Immediately after the Civil War, we pulled back all that money. So there's less money in the system, and at the same time, there's an increasing number of immigrants coming over.
Okay, so isn't it good to have deflation for like overall economy?
It's good to have deflation if you have $1 million in the bank. But if you owe money, it's bad to have deflation because now it's harder to pay off your debt.
And isn't it like most of Americans or most of the world is
In debt.
So
So
essentially
if
like
you're
this
sitting
bad.
on $1 million, your million technically is worth like 1.5 million in a deflationary cycle. But if you owe $1 million, you now technically owe more money. And all of the farmers were in debt. The average person doesn't make enough money for this to be beneficial. In fact, the companies now say, oh, well, your money is worth more, therefore we're gonna cut your wages. So it's bad for the debtor. And do you guys remember that math problem I gave you with like Shays' Rebellion? Inflation, they make enough on their crop, they pay off their debt easily. Deflation, they're crushed. So that's kind of what's happening, and there's also a lot of other bad things happening for the farmer. Mother Nature is against them. They would actually say like a grasshopper cloud could destroy your entire crop in like a couple days. They don't have insurance. They don't have a government bailout. So you could have the grasshoppers leaving nothing but the mortgage. You could have a flood wipe out your crop. You could have a drought wipe out your crop. Oh, and then the government is going to tax you, state, locally. The railroads will be against you. A really high tariff can crush you. The simple point is the farmer is getting crushed from all sorts of different angles here. So today, the farmer also faces problems, right? But today, the farmer has a huge safety net. Do you know what the safety net of the farmer is today? The government pays them. The government subsidizes farming. The farmers in Iowa just got crushed by that tariff. The government bailed them out with $12 billion. So there's a safety net. We recognize the need for farming. We recognize the turbulence of farming, right? Back then, they're on their own. So back then, wow, they're gonna struggle, and they had little political organization early on. They'll claw their way up in politics, and that's kind of where we pick up the pieces. Kind of makes sense of the problems of the farmers.
So what's grasshopper?
What's a grasshopper?
No.
Grasshoppers can eat your crop.
Oh, I thought that was like a
No, not a nickname. Like it's literally a grasshopper. Okay, they're getting organized. So this is the first name to note. It's like a social organization at first, like, hey farmer, you live way over there, you live way over there, we should get together once a week and talk about life. That's how the Grange begins. It's a simple social organization for farmers, and once they all start to get together, they realize they have a whole lot in common. They realize that a lot of their problems are because of the railroads or because of the government. And these guys eventually start to get involved in local and then state politics. And they realize that they can potentially pass some laws to regulate all of the things that are hurting them, right? You actually know the names of these laws regulating the railroads and all of the things that hurt them. The Granger laws or the Grange movement. You guys also remember the court cases detailing the validity or legality of these Granger laws.
Munn versus Illinois? Yeah.
Munn versus Illinois. So let's say they have some success until the Wabash case overturns it all, then they go back to struggling again. So the point is these farmers are organizing, right? They're organizing into politics. They got the Grange, they're getting together, they get co-ops. A co-op would be like cooperative buying or selling. That kind of makes sense. They still have co-ops today. There's one just down the road on like 2920. So if you all buy together, you get to pay less. If you all sell together, it helps. So they're getting organized. The timeline of this is about the 1860s through some of the 1870s. By the 1870s, they get together in these farmer alliances and they actually publish a political platform. I've taught you pieces of that political platform. Inflation, the unlimited coinage of silver. They want a graduated income tax. They want government control of the trusts, government control of the railroads. They want direct election of senators. They basically want a hands-on government with some help. So they're getting highly involved. And by the 1890s, they're so organized, they form an official political party and they win electoral votes. What is their official political party?
Populist.
Who's their candidate?
McKinley in 1896.
James Weaver. So you have James Weaver by 1892, and that's kind of the cliffhanger that I left you off on. We're picking up in 1896, where it's not going to be McKinley. McKinley's actually going to be anti-farmer.
What's the one? I can't remember his name. He's on the last quiz.
Tom Watson,
Yeah, that guy.
he was a populist.
Okay. So
He was one of the populist leaders.
All right. Yeah, I chose him instead of Weaver.
But James Weaver is your official populist candidate in 1892.
Okay,
So the populists will still be around in 1896, but they got a new guy. And that's where we are now. You ready?
I feel like Tom Watson's such a farmer name. Like
Tom Watson's also a golfer name. He's a really famous golfer, one of the best ever. Okay, 1896. Let's first make a special note next to 1896 and say that it's a really, really, really important election. It's one of our more important elections that you'll ever run into. I'll even put it up there like a 1828 type election. So it's a biggie, right? It's one that I can ask you a lot of questions about. It's not one where they attack the character of candidates like 1884. And the issue itself is kind of boring. It's gold versus silver, inflation versus deflation. The candidates would wear like little gold bugs or silver bugs, or if they straddle the issue, they'd wear like one of each. That issue itself is kind of boring, but the candidates are going to be pretty interesting and how they incorporate those issues into the daily lives of Americans. So as for the candidates, meet William Jennings Bryan. And by the way, you'll know him so well, you'll basically abbreviate his name into WJB. He's kind of our next Henry Clay in that he runs for president and loses every 4 years. So yes, he'll lose in 1896, but don't worry, he comes back in 1900 and loses again. He'll try again in 1904, loses again. He's still around in 1908, loses again. 1912, there's a new guy who will put him as Secretary of State, then he decides to dramatically quit as Secretary of State. We think we're done with WJB, but in the middle of the 1920s, he comes back as a lawyer in a really famous court case, and then he, of course, has a dramatic death. So I think he'll be with us like through the rest of the 9 weeks. Meet WJB, and here's his famous speech. They say he bursts onto the scene. He's like really charismatic, a great speaker, like a preacher-like speaker. There's his famed quote, his speech. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
So he's a silver guy.
He's a silver guy. And that's kind of powerful vocabulary. He's incorporating the Bible, the whole crown of thorns, cross, crucify mankind. He's saying you're dying because of the gold standard. And that's pretty powerful to the people, right? He also is the first ever to do these whistle-stop campaigns. Like, he goes to the people. Candidates never did this before. And today you're constantly bombarded with rallies and politicians speaking to the people, right? He's the first ever to do that. Prior to WJB, they sat back, the newspapers did the work. They didn't even campaign for themselves. Like, they wouldn't even make a public speech. He's the first one to go on these whistle-stop tours, uses the railroad, goes town to town, makes a charismatic speech, has a whole lot of support. And his big message, let's coin silver, the unlimited coinage of silver. Let's coin it at a 16-to-1 ratio, coin silver, coin silver, coin silver is his message. And there's another group out there that's like, wait, what? You want to coin silver as the Democratic candidate? We also want to coin silver. The populists are like, he's stealing my thunder. So you know what happens? They merge. And you would think this is a guaranteed victory. The Dem Pops, as they're called, the populists carry the West already. The Democrats carry the South already. All you got to do is take some of that urban vote, win one of those highly populated states, and you got a guaranteed victory here. So on paper, this merger between the Democrats and the populists, it looks amazing. It looks like they're going to win this election of 1896. Because think about it, did this gold standard help out average Joe? No. But they're up against Mr. Money. This is Mark Hanna. He's not the candidate. He's the money behind the candidate. Mark Hanna, I think you should know, is a multi-millionaire businessman who's going to promote the Republican Party and their pro-business interests. And his ability to get donations for the Republican Party is going to make that money talk and work effectively for the ultimate victory for William McKinley, his good buddy. So he wants McKinley as candidate, and he gets millions of dollars from his pro-business friends to spend on the campaign. They end up controlling the newspapers, they print flyers, call it propaganda because they kind of fabricate some stuff within their propaganda. And then they do some nasty stuff within the businesses. All their friends are the business owners. They get the business owners to tell the employees, hey, if you guys vote for WJB, don't worry showing up for work because we're going to have to close our doors. So they intimidate the workers. They basically use that money to really pressure any Republican-leaning person to ultimately vote for McKinley. So I'll show you some of that propaganda, both for and against him, but it's kind of interesting. But the money will talk. The money is effective. The money can still win you a campaign today. So just kind of understand the impact of money. He's got a lot of millionaire business friends. This one, they attack the Cross of Gold speech in a very effective manner. His Cross of Gold speech, it did hit home to a lot of people. But when the Republican press publishes this, they are bashing WJB's Cross of Gold speech. Do you see how? Calling him sacrilegious, standing on the
Bible.
That's pretty powerful. He's standing on the Bible. He's trivializing the Bible with a, what? Crown of thorns with a little price tag attached to it. A cross with a price tag attached to it. They're bashing WJB in a highly effective manner. And that will persuade a few. So just understand that the power of political cartoons is still there. And it looks like this guy in the background is flying an anarchy flag. Like, ooh, you support WJB. Look what you're going to get. This guy's standing on the Bible and he's sacrilegious. He's bad. WJB was just a baby during the Civil War. McKinley was a veteran. So they're using the power of the press. They're using their money. They're using their influence within the factories. But there's still kind of a voice that attacks Mark Hanna. This would be, and you can kind of see the quality of the cartoons is not as great, but some are attacking Mark Hanna for his unfair influence over the Republican Party. There's McKinley as like a little kid wanting a piece of the apple, but Mr. Moneybags Hanna is clearly controlling it all. He's like the true boss of the Republicans. Look at Mark Hanna, all of the money. Mark Hanna, bossing McKinley. He's always depicted with like money bags everywhere. So yes, the guy was influential. Mark Hanna, sitting on his piles of cash, death to labor. And here's his quote, "I'm confident the working men are with us." Well, the working men are kind of forced to be with them, or they'd lose their jobs. So yeah, that amount of influence was, very persuasive. In the end, make a quick call. What color wins? You say red, right? Let's do some math.
They got more electoral.
Look at this. It looks like, wow, the red states, they got it. But the Democrats, the farmers, they win the entire West. But let's do some math here. We got 4, 7, 10, 13, 16, 19, 23, 27, 35. We got 45 electoral votes with all the farming states in the West. Yeah? Throw Texas in and you got 60. Find 60 electoral votes in the populated areas.
New York and Pennsylvania.
God, and that's 68. So all Texas and the entire West is just 60. You carry these two and you cover the entire West. So that entire farmer vote doesn't mean too much. It was powerful for the farmers, but they're not going to carry an election. This book, by the way, actually is like an allegory for that entire story, which you might have.
I love that movie.
Yeah, you might know the movie, you might know the book. Each of the characters represents someone from 1896. You may not have thought of it, but the author here is an advocate for McKinley, saying follow the yellow brick road, the gold standard. This author calls out the cowardly lion, which is supposed to be WJB, the industrial worker, the farmer. Little Dorothy, she just wants to magically go back home. She wants some kind of miracle, right? And what's going to take her back home?
The Good Witch.
Don't you click your heels together?
Yeah.
In the book, what color are her shoes?
Red.
In the book,
They're like a liquid thing.
in the book, they're silver.
Oh, they're silver.
In the movie, they changed it to red because everything was colorized and it would pop more on screen. So they're kind of calling out the entire, silver standard as this falsehood of going back home miraculously. Anyway, if you were to click that, if my smart board was smart, it would tell you what every character represents. Lastly, Bryan focused too much on the farmer. And again, those urban workers were kind of pushed into voting Republican or not voting at all. McKinley's well-financed campaign, that tips the tides. McKinley will win again in 1900, but 1900.
Death.
He'll die, Teddy Roosevelt will take over, and that's when things really start to change.
Wait, so how many years is it every year, every 20 years that he died? And is it still coming today?
No.
Yeah, every election.
Someone who broke it.
Ronald Reagan,
Yeah.
1980. That's as far as I need to get today. So everything I covered, that's on the quiz tomorrow. Remember, we're not on block, so you're in here for another 20 minutes.